Welcome to the Insightful Professor. In this video, we'll talk about the topic of privacy and anonymity. We'll start by noting that in the world of today, information is viewed as both a valuable and demanded resource. The problem that we're faced with is that modern society is interconnected and relies on the dissemination and sharing of information in both the private and the public sectors. In fact, much information is required to be made available in electronic form. When information is shared in a statistical or tabular form, privacy of individuals is generally preserved because what's presented is effectively aggregate information, not revealing details of any individual. However, the usefulness of such summarized information may be limited to whatever that nature is of summarization that was applied. In many situations, the specific stored data would be more useful for analysis if it were made available. However, the association of such data with specific individuals becomes a concern of the privacy of these individuals. When information is released in a summarized form, we refer to such information as macrodata. When the individual data that was used to produce this summarization is released, we refer to that information as microdata. So in this video, we'll discuss some approaches to ensuring the privacy and anonymity of the individuals for whom microdata was released. Data privacy is concerned with protecting the anonymity of individuals. Note that the entities for which information is collected need not be individual people, but could be organizations. In either case, such entities are called respondents. Information about an individual is collected every day. People often join associations or groups. They shop for products, and they perform various other daily activities. In the United States, there are billions of privately owned records that describe each citizen's finances, interests, and demographics. These references will serve as our primary references for information we'll present in this video. These journal papers were published several years back. However, these papers continue to be relevant with respect to the general topic of protecting the anonymity of respondents. Much of the work addressed in these papers deals with something called k-anonymity. The data that has been collected about individuals is released in some form to be used for purposes of analysis and decision-making. The key challenge that exists is to determine the optimal balance between improved privacy protection of the individuals and the usefulness of the data that's released for purposes of analysis. To protect the anonymity of the respondents, those folks that hold the data often remove or encrypt explicit identifiers such as names, addresses, or phone numbers. The process of removing such personally identifiable information is referred to as de-identifying the data. Note that the encryption or removal of sensitive information from datasets is a form of what is sometimes referred to as sanitization. It should be noted that de-identification by itself provides no guarantee of anonymity. The information that is released often contains other data, such as race, birth date, sex, zip code. This information could be linked to publicly available information to re-identify the respondents and infer information that was not intended for disclosure. We indicated that our primary references are a couple of older journal papers. Here we give a more recent publication for those interested in more recent work in the area of privacy preservation. Most municipalities that have collected data about their population sell this information, and this information includes identities of individuals along with the basic demographics. And this information might take the form of local census data, voter registration lists, city directories, tax assessors, or motor vehicle information. Typical data contained in these databases might include names, birth dates, addresses, telephone numbers, family status, and employment and salary histories. Such personal information can be used for linking the identities to the de-identified information to which we referred just a moment ago. This would allow for re-identification of the respondents. Note that such data would often be shared for business and legal reasons. So it's often the case that data collected for one purpose may be used for another purpose. Historically, the dissemination and sharing of information was mostly in the form of macrodata. Macrodata protection techniques are based on the selective obfuscation of sensitive cells. However, many situations require that the specific stored data, the microdata, be released. Remember that the term microdata refers to stored structured data on individuals. Microdata could be collected and used by various government agencies, such as the Census Bureau or Department of Motor Vehicles. It's estimated that in the United States, there are billions of privately owned records that describe information about the citizens of the country. Also, information bureaus hold the largest and most detailed database on American consumers. Note that while our primary concern is directed toward data collected about individuals, for example, through these information bureaus or through local or federal government agencies, we want to consider for a moment broadening our view of microdata. After all, our concern really is privacy preservation. Note our initial comment on the estimate of privately owned records, referring to the United States having billions of such records. This estimate comes from one of those papers I cited back around the year 2000. This was a number that was thrown out. Think for a moment, what was the state or extent of social media at that time? Consider also what's the state or extent of social media today. See, considering that some of the private and personal data that exists may reside in the realm of social media, what would we expect to be a more accurate estimate of privately owned records today? Note that microdata is also used by commercial industries such as insurance companies, health organizations, or retailers. It helps them in their decision making as they target certain customer bases. Several approaches, including randomization, redaction, and other transformations, have been applied to preserve privacy of the individual with released microdata. One possibility that exists is to replace the explicit identification information, something, say, like a social security number, with a randomized placeholder. But this replacement alone is not sufficient to ensure privacy, due again to a possible linking of this released data with other publicly available data sets. The released data contains other information which, when linked with this private data, with this microdata, could be used to actually identify the individual or narrow it down to a small group of individuals or entities. This is referred to as the problem of re-identification. In addition to the identity disclosure problem, other potential privacy problems exist. These include attribute disclosure. This occurs when something about an individual is learned from the released data. There's also inferential disclosure. Here, some characteristic of an individual can be inferred more accurately because of the data release. Attributes whose disclosure need to be protected in the strictest sense are denoted to be sensitive. One approach to handling sensitive attributes is to exclude them from public use datasets. The downside here is that this may make the dataset less useful for some data mining exercise or for some other form of data analysis. We want to mention that several microdata disclosure protection techniques have been developed in the context of statistical databases. These include scrambling, swapping values, or adding noise, while maintaining the overall statistical property of the result. However, for many data mining and other analysis tasks, it's often important that the released microdata preserves what we'll call truthful information within each row or tuple of released data. This is a data quality requirement, and it makes inappropriate those techniques that disturb the data and compromise the correctness of a single piece of information. Let's take a little closer look at the disclosure problems. Generalization and suppression serve to provide anonymity while preserving the truthfulness of the information. Generalization involves substituting the values of a given attribute with more general values. A simple example of generalization could involve generalizing a postal address to the street by dropping the number. This can be taken a step further by generalizing to the city, to the county, to the state, and so on. The more general the data, the more difficult the task of identification, but also perhaps the less useful the information provided. Another example of a transformation by generalization is to replace the exact date of birth by a portion of the date, for example, only the year. The replacement of such less specific data with more general data makes the identification process more difficult. Note, however, that too much generalization could make the transformed data useless. For example, generalizing the date of birth to the century has little value when considering current insurers. On the other hand, suppression is another option. This can be viewed as the ultimate generalization, since no information is released. Two goals of data transformation are usefulness and privacy. The challenge is to find the right trade-off. Many approaches to privacy preservation have been reported in the literature, each providing a unique solution for a particular situation. The problem is that with so many solutions, it's difficult to produce an industry standard. Finally, we comment that generalization has the advantage of allowing the release of all the single tuples or rows in a table, although in a more generalized form. A statistical database is a database whose users may retrieve only aggregated statistics. For example, a user might be able to obtain information about the average salary of employees, but not information about the salary of any individual employee. The security requirement in statistical databases is to provide access to statistics about groups of entities while protecting the confidentiality of individual entities. The privacy concern with statistical databases is that a user might obtain confidential information about an individual entity by correlating different statistics. Techniques for protecting statistical databases follow two main approaches. First, we restrict the statistical queries that can be made. That is, as an example, queries that identify a small or large number of tuples, or the data that can be published. In the second approach, we provide protection by returning to the user a modified result. The modification can be enforced directly on the stored data or at runtime, that is, when computing the result to be returned to the user. One approach to solving the identity disclosure problem is to perturb the data using techniques like adding noise or swapping values, while also ensuring that some statistical properties of the data are maintained. While a risk of re-identification may be reduced, there still will be some data loss. Access control models offer protection against direct access to sensitive information. Indirect access to sensitive data may be possible via inferences. Sensitive information could be inferred from non-sensitive data and metadata. Here we say that metadata may refer to database constraints, database dependency, integrity constraints, or other outside information. Inference is the process of posing queries and deducing unauthorized information from the legitimate responses received. The problem that occurs through this inference is called the inference problem. Depending on the level of accuracy by which sensitive information is revealed, full disclosure or partial disclosure might occur. Let's consider an example. The names and salaries of individuals may be unclassified individually, but taken together, they are classified. It could be possible to retrieve names and employee numbers and later retrieve salaries and employee numbers, and then make the associations between names and salaries. Note the inference problem in databases occurs when sensitive information can be discerned from non-sensitive data and metadata. Early research on the inference problem did not take data mining into consideration. With data mining, users have tools to make deductions and extract potentially sensitive patterns. A data modification scheme is used to modify original values of a database in order to ensure privacy protection. Methods of modification include perturbation, This is accomplished by the alteration of an attribute value by a new value. For example, changing a 1 value to a 0 value, or adding some noise. Blocking is another method. This refers to the replacement of an original value with a question mark. Aggregation or merging refers to the combination of several values into a coarser category. Swapping means interchanging values of individual records. This will preserve the overall content within the data set, but distort to some degree values of individual records or tuples. Sampling is the releasing of data for only a sample of a population. The data presented in this table have been de-identified by suppressing the names and the Social Security numbers. This was done to avoid explicitly disclosing the identity of the respondent. The rest of the information remains unaltered. The problem that exists is that values of those attributes which have been released could also appear in some external table jointly with the individual identity, allowing them to be tracked. For example, this released microdata could be linked to a voter registration list. Here we have information from such a list. The matching date of birth, sex, and zip code from the publicly released data and the sanitized anonymous data can be linked. Thus, we can reasonably determine that Jane Doe is the individual who has a health problem of shortness of breath, revealed in the final row of our sanitized data. In some cases, linking can allow identification of a restricted set of individuals to whom the released information could refer. This example demonstrated an exact match. Recall that data in the previous example demonstrated an exact match of de-identified medical data with non-medical data. In some cases, linking allows one to detect a restricted set of individuals among whom there is the actual data respondent. To avoid release of de-identified microdata exposed through linking attacks, microdata protection techniques can be applied. These include sampling, swapping values, or adding noise to the data while maintaining some overall statistical properties. Many releases require truthful information with each tuple, so to preserve the quality of the data, it's inappropriate to use techniques that disturb the data and compromise the correctness of single or individual tuples. The concept of k-anonymity comes into play. K-anonymity, together with its enforcement via generalization and suppression, has been proposed as an approach to protect respondents' identities while releasing truthful information. When releasing data for a data mining exercise or other analysis, the objective is to be able to release information while ensuring the anonymity of that information. While guaranteeing complete anonymity is an impossible task, it is reasonable to employ some measure of anonymity protection, what is referred to as k-anonymity. A data release is said to satisfy k-anonymity if every row released cannot be related to fewer than k respondents, where k is some positive integer set by the data holder. The challenge to achieving k-anonymity is knowing how many individuals each released record matches. This information can be known precisely only by explicitly linking the release data with externally available data. Because this is an impossible task for the data holder, the key to satisfying the k-anonymity requirement is to translate the requirement in terms of the released data themselves. So the k-anonymity requirement states that each release of data must be such that every combination of values of what are called quasi-identifiers can be indistinctly matched to at least k individuals. A quasi-identifier is a set of attributes in the released microdata that in combination can be linked with external information to re-identify the respondents to whom information refers. Well, what does this mean? It means that knowing which attributes can be used for linking is a basic requirement for this form of protection. Techniques for providing anonymity in the release of microdata that preserve its truthfulness include generalization and suppression. The removal of explicit identifiers is the first step to achieving anonymity. All explicit identifiers have been encrypted or suppressed. The k-anonymity requirement says that each release of data must be such that every combination of values of these quasi-identifiers that we described can be indistinctly matched to at least k respondents. So the concept of k-anonymity tries to capture one of the main requirements that has been followed by the statistical community and by agencies releasing the data. The released data should be indistinguishably related to no less than a certain number of respondents. Since it seems impossible to make assumptions on the data sets available for linking to external attackers or curious data recipients, essentially, k-anonymity takes a safe approach, requiring that in the released data itself, the respondent be indistinguishable within a given set with respect to the set of attributes. Generalization consists in substituting the values of a given attribute with more general values, a point we had made previously. A domain refers to a set of values that an attribute might assume. Assume the existence of a set of generalized domains that contains the generalized values. For example, zip codes can be generalized by dropping the least significant digit. Postal addresses could be generalized to the street by dropping the street number. The attribute value stored in the table of released data can be substituted upon release with such generalized values. There's a mapping between each domain and its generalizations. Generalizing an attribute means substituting its values with corresponding values from the more general domain. Generalization has the advantage of allowing the release of all the single tuples in a table, although in a more general form. Suppressing means to remove data from the table so that they are not released. Suppression is applied at the tuple or row level, meaning that a tuple or a row can be suppressed only in its entirety. Suppression is used to moderate the generalization process when a limited number of outliers, tuples with less than k occurrences, would force a great amount of generalization. We've been talking about ways to achieve privacy, but in case it's not clear, let's try to explain why we need to do this. First off, we note large quantities of data can be collected and processed. Well, due to the combination of large memory sizes, very large disk storage capacity, and network bandwidth, this allows data to be collected, stored, and analyzed in ways that were impossible in the past due to restricted access to data and also the expense of processing the data. Additionally, there have been new developments in terms of approaches to examining data. Data mining techniques and sophisticated algorithms have been developed. The result is it's now possible to infer information not intended for disclosure, accomplished by linking de-identified medical records, as an example, with other publicly available data, looking at the unique characteristics found in the released data. Recall that de-identification refers to the removal of explicit identifiers, such as a social security number. Having obtained an identity, such identity disclosure then often implies leakage of sensitive information. So it's all of this that makes privacy a growing concern for people. That, of course, brings up another question. What exactly is privacy? Well, it's not easy to provide a simple definition of this term. There are different meanings that may exist or qualify in different situations or different contexts. Consider privacy in a global network infrastructure where users interact with remote information sources to retrieve data or use online services. There's privacy of the user, the problem of protecting the relationship of users with a particular action and outcome. There's privacy of communication, the problem of protecting confidentiality of personal information when transmitted over the network. There's also privacy of the information itself, involves privacy policies, as well as techniques for ensuring proper data protection. So we might wish to protect the relationship between a user and messages sent, such as queries for retrieving information or requests for using a particular online service. Protecting privacy of a request to a service provider by hiding the content of the request from every party as well as from the service provider. And the requirement of a privacy policy is to establish responsibilities of the data holder with respect to data use and dissemination, rights of the user to whom the information refers to regulate such use and dissemination, and each user should be able to control further disclosure, view data collected about him or her, and possibly make or require corrections. Let's consider each of these privacy concerns in detail. First, the privacy of the user. Here, we are interested in protecting the identities of parties that communicate through a network. The goal is to avoid attacks that trace those parties that are communicating. We deal with this problem using various techniques and protocols to achieve what we call anonymous communication. Anonymous communication refers to protecting the relationship that exists between the senders and the messages that they send. This is called sender anonymity. Anonymous communication also deals with what we call recipient anonymity, the protection of the relationship between the recipients and the messages that they receive. So anonymous communication involves both of these. The idea is that we have anonymous senders who send messages to anonymous recipients. There are a number of approaches that can be used to provide anonymous communication. We'll take a quick look at a couple of these. Mixed networks are a way of achieving anonymity on communication networks. A mixed network can be thought of as a routing protocol that uses a chain of proxy servers called mixes. These mixes take in messages from multiple senders and then shuffle them and send them back out in random order to the next destination, which may be another mixed node. By following this process, we increase the difficulty for an eavesdropper to trace end-to-end communication, that is, the link between the source of the request and the destination. Additionally, a mix is only aware of the node that it immediately received the message from and the immediate destination to which the shuffled message will be directed. Having this limited knowledge among mixes makes the network resistant to malicious mixed nodes. Onion routing is another solution to ensure anonymous connections. The main goal of onion routing is to guarantee malicious users cannot determine the contents of messages flowing from sender to recipient and cannot verify whether the sender and the recipient are communicating with each other. When the sender wants to communicate anonymously with a recipient, an anonymous connection must be set up. The sender connects to an onion router that prepares an onion. What's an onion? An onion is a layered data structure that includes information about the root of the anonymous connection. The onion router randomly selects other onion routers and generates a message for each such router, providing it with symmetric keys for decrypting messages and telling it what the next hop in the path will be, either an onion router or the final recipient. Anonymity is only provided from the first to the last onion router. The connections from the sender to the first onion router and from the last onion router to the recipient are not anonymous. The basic concepts of onion routing were developed at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in the mid-1990s and later refined by DARPA. The goal was to provide secure intelligence communication online. Onion routers communicate using TLS and ephemeral keys. An ephemeral key is created for one specific use and then destroyed immediately after that use. Now we consider privacy of communication. This is related to two considerations: the protection of the confidentiality of personal information sent through a network, as well as the protection of the content of the request. Confidentiality of personal information transmitted over the network can be assured by adopting protocols such as SSL that encrypt it. There's also a need to protect the request content, known as private information retrieval, or PIR. When considering protecting the request content, there are many real-world scenarios where the request content can be misused by service providers. For instance, consider a medical database that contains information about known illnesses, symptoms, treatment options, specialists, and treatment costs. Suppose a user submits a query to the medical database to collect information about a specific illness. Any other user, including the database administrator, who is able to observe such a query, can then infer that the requester, or a near relative or friend, might be suffering from that specific illness. Finally, privacy of the information. Privacy of the information is related to the definition of privacy policies that express and combine different protection requirements. This also extends to the development of technologies for ensuring proper data protection. One important aspect of the data protection issue relates to the protection of the identities of the users to whom the data refer. This means that the anonymity of the users must again be guaranteed. Anonymity does not imply that no information at all is released, but requires that information that is released be non-identifiable. Remember, we're not talking about suppression. Given a collection of personal information about a user, the privacy of the user is protected if the value of his or her personal information is kept private. So whenever a subset of personal information can be used to identify the user, the anonymity of the user depends on keeping such a subset private. In this video, we've been discussing privacy and anonymity, with the emphasis being on anonymity as the means of achieving privacy. Let's consider what we've been discussing. Ensuring proper anonymity protection requires the investigation of the following different issues. Identity disclosure protection. This occurs when it is possible to re-identify a user, called a respondent, from the released data. Attribute disclosure protection. Inference channel protection. Protection of anonymity is a key aspect in many different contexts, where the identities of users or organizations, associations, and so on, to whom the data make a reference, have been removed, encrypted, or coded in some way. The identity information removed or encoded to produce the anonymous data includes such things as names, telephone numbers, social security numbers. Techniques for limiting the possibility of re-identifying respondents should therefore be adopted. Identity disclosure protection alone does not guarantee privacy of sensitive information because all respondents in a group could have the same sensitive information. To overcome this issue, mechanisms that protect sensitive information about respondents should be adopted. Although apparently anonymous, de-identified data may contain other identifying information that uniquely or almost uniquely distinguishes the user. This other identifying information may include such things as gender, zip code, and the full date of birth. By linking such information to publicly available databases, associating them to the user's identity, a data recipient can determine to which user each piece of released information belongs, or restrict the uncertainty to a specific subset of users. With the background presented in this video, let's take a look at the real world, rather than just consider this as theoretical. There is a blog available through the FTC, and I've put a URL here that refers back to a specific publication that appeared in 2016 relating to open police data re-identification risks. Open police data initiatives are enabling increased transparency and citizen oversight. They are releasing records, and when the records are readily accessible or easily searchable, there may be some undesirable consequences that occur. There's a concern of the possibility that people who access open police data may be able to identify crime victims or reveal their locations. In situations where we're talking about victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, this could put these victims at a security risk or put their safety at risk. This is triggered by the fact that police departments have been encouraged to make data available in electronic formats that can be downloaded, searched, and analyzed. These departments have been encouraged to release data on the use of force, pedestrian and vehicle stops, officer-involved shootings, and other things in order to build community trust and strengthen accountability. However, the nature of the data that's been released has opened up the possibility of re-identification. In one city, police records available to the public included the names of the complainant, addresses, and ages. Some records, including those related to sexual assaults, had been removed, but the remaining records appeared to contain fully identified victim information. In another city, names were removed, but detailed location information remained in the records. And in yet another city, the name and house number of the victim had been removed, but the street address was retained. From an examination of open police data archives, it is often unclear what de-identification process is being employed or how rigorously it's actually been applied. People often make the assumption that if names and obvious identifiers such as street address and social security numbers have been removed from the records, that the records will not be re-identified. However, as we've seen in our examination of privacy, such supposedly de-identified records may be re-identified. Thus, ensuring privacy and achieving anonymity is not easily accomplished. Let me conclude by providing you with one additional resource from the NIST, a publication entitled De-Identification of Personal Information. I encourage you to take a look at this to further investigate some of the requirements for de-identification of data.